My name is Mary. And thank you very much. And for those of you who've just heard the term geomorphology for the very first time, it is the science of scenery. Why does it look like that? Why are the mountains that high? Why does the river go around bends like that? Okay, so I'm a recent returned immigrant, came back during the peak of the crisis and came back to a country that I felt hadn't actually changed significantly enough for me, and I'm guessing for you, in terms of the scientists' contribution to dealing with some of the issues that were clearly facing this country. And so I've changed my research focus to go back to looking at extreme events in Ireland, and particularly in looking at flood events. So I want to talk to you today a little bit of pulling it back now. I'm a geographer, so we talk about issues of scale. So I'm going to pull it back a little bit in terms of temporal and spatial scales and talk a little bit about flooding in general before we'll zoom straight in then to Ireland and to some case studies in Cork that have been completed quite recently. So if we just basically reinforce some knowledge here around why do rivers flood? First of all, I want to basically remind you they're supposed to flood. It's a natural process, and one of the conflicts that have arisen is because of our I suppose historical evolution of building our towns and cities in the most fertile land, which happens to be floodplains, and then not being able to deal with the response, the natural response of the river to our presence there. But we have a lot of different causes of floods. If we look just at river floods, there's the atmospheric ones, of course, rainfall, snowmelt, and even these ice jam floods, where the river itself freezes over. And Ireland, in its history, our rivers have frozen over during past colder phases. And these ice jam floods probably did happen in our history, where the water was moving underneath, the ice broke up on the surface, and these big chunks of ice basically caused a dam in the river that caused localized flooding. You can have tectonic hazards, which, you know, there was a little earthquake there in Donegal, wasn't there, a few weeks ago. But one of the responses are that they can trigger landslides to come down off the hillsides, and they can dam rivers, and then the water piles up behind them, and eventually those dams will breach. And of course, we have recently had rainfall-triggered bog bursts that have gone down into river systems and have temporarily dammed those rivers as well. So these might seem quite different types of causes, definitely not tectonic precipitation-induced landslides, but still relevant to Ireland. And we need to think bigger about the causes of flood, or we need to include the causes of flood when we're thinking about ways of mitigating or adapting to those floods. It's not just there's a lot of rain, there's a lot of different features or factors that cause it. And of course we have this technological, when features that we engineer and put into rivers fail, because they are built, we were told as geographers when we were being educated that engineers design and build for the length of their lifetime, 50 years. So basically a lot of big failures of dams, etc., have happened around the world and can also cause floods. I want to also remind you, floods can be good. Floods can actually bring positive feedbacks into systems. For example, they bring nutrients and fresh soil onto floodplains, and that's used for agricultural areas. They recharge aquifers. So much of Ireland now, we're getting our water from groundwater systems. These need to be recharged, and they're recharged by flooding of waters across these very highly porous floodplains. And so the idea is that floods can provide important benefits. And so this diagram is basically showing you that there is banded areas of extremes. That if you have rainfall and floods happening within a certain banded area that's perceived to be the mean or normal, when you go beyond those, they become what we would call hazards. In other words, that they provide some kind of effect on humans that are living adjacent to them. And then they become disasters when we really have these very high floods. But we're talking about hydrological hazards. So it's floods and it's droughts. Too much water and too little water. And we've all seen recently in Ireland and across Northwest Europe, we've had this drought last summer. And that affected our water supplies of local communities, affected the environmental flows within our river systems here in Ireland. It affected the aquatic health of our river systems. And of course, when you have a drought, the vegetation dies and the soil gets exposed. And then you have the next rainfall, and we come back into our seasonal rainfall, and all of that available sediment is then pulsed into the river system. So the juxtaposition of, I suppose, rainfall trends, drying and wetting or wetting and wetting, all influence what the flood will do when it next falls. So it's quite a complex problem in terms of the causes of the floods and the sequence of weather systems or seasonal weather trends. So we have had extreme events very recently in Ireland. We can look at the Donegal Floods that happened in August 2017 that caused massive damage to infrastructure, landslides, invaded this poor woman's kitchen and destroyed her house, and of course extensive flooding across adjacent lands, cutting off access routes, etc. But 27 was also a bad year for America, and there was a massive reality check for them. This is basically one of many cities that have been built in, as was mentioned earlier, not a great location, but it was built for the convenience of the early settlers there. And this was truly a very, very extreme event. We had 1 meter of rainfall falling. Here's a kind of visual that shows that we have 14 to 15 trillion gallons with 5 more trillion gallons expected. And here we have a comparison to Hurricane Katrina, which we were all quite familiar with. But at the same time that the Houston floods were going off and Donegal was recoiling from the incredible effect of the floods there, how many of you heard about the Mumbai floods? And so there is an onus on the media to perhaps get a grip on their biases in terms of where they're reporting. And you might go, well, why is she talking about Mumbai? We're here in Cork. But I would actually say that I'd like to transfer this idea that perhaps within Ireland we have a bias too to focus mostly on the big urban areas, the big cities. And it's people who live in villages, who have livelihoods, who have families, who have infrastructure that also get neglected in the planning for floods in our country. So just like we're biased against perhaps other parts of our own planet in Mumbai, and you can see here that there was over 1,000 people were killed and 40 million were affected. Nothing compared to Houston, but that's all we heard about was Houston. And then Donegal kind of peeked into the news feed for a little while. We're no strangers to extreme events. Now, this is one of the kind of historical events, the night of the big wind, 1839. This is when a hurricane hit Ireland. It was absolutely devastating. This is the time when we lived in small huts. We had fires going throughout the whole night. There was thatched roofs. The roofs blew off these houses. The wind blew down the chimneys, sent embers everywhere, set the thatch on fire. So all the people ran out of their houses so they wouldn't be killed by the fire, took their children with them, and there's stories of them hanging onto their children as they're being blown by these winds. This was an absolutely devastating, catastrophic night for people. And back in the time when there was a massive spiritual, I suppose, knowledge base around our environment, everybody had thought that this was some kind of punishment by some spiritual being for the people that were living in Ireland. And I suppose that does kind of ring some bells for today's floods, perhaps in Ireland as well. But I hadn't really ever heard of this up until recently when Ophelia struck, and suddenly everybody was talking about hurricanes and going like, what? Ireland has hurricanes? And you look back, here's the track of Hurricane Debbie, a Category 3 storm in 1961, just skirting here the west coast of Ireland. And here, of course, we'll all remember Storm Ophelia, which came and hit us here in 2017. We didn't know what was going on. We thought it was very interesting that the sense of humour of Ireland came out to the fore. What's going to happen when we wake up in the morning? Are we going to be blown? Oh, of course. That's our version of Brexit. We were all told, batten down the hatches, it's a red event, and certainly we took all our kids out of school and took them home to keep them safe. Wow. Not my daughter, but definitely it was. But so we have experienced these big events, and so a lot of the narrative today is around climate change. So what are the facts around climate change? Because as Chris said earlier on, we are scientists and we like to deal in facts. And so here is a modelled prediction for Europe for heavy rainfall in our future. And so this is a prediction that's going to come between 2071 and 2100. And here is Ireland. And what you can see here is anything that's in green is this here is winter and this is summer. We're looking here at between a 15 and 35% increase in heavy precipitation. And here is our summer forecast, where we're looking at some similar increases as well, although Cork looks like it might actually be in the negative, according to this model. This is a model. It's based on data, but any model has to rule out a lot of parameters that it's inputting to the model into that space in order for the model to be able to work and function. So they are simplified versions of reality, but we're growing in confidence in terms of the model output. It's giving us more and more sophisticated and higher computer powers to be able to deliver some more reliable knowledge. But why should we care about these big rainfall events? I drove through one on the way down here yesterday, and it was really hard, and I was trying to talk to John on the phone, and the noise on the roof of the car was quite phenomenal. But I drove through it and I passed. I didn't have to drive through floods, but it was very intense. But in terms of rainfall, there's two types that we need to be aware of in Ireland. This first type is called infiltration excess overland flow. The rain falls far too fast and far too heavy for it to be absorbed by the soil. So the top of the soil fills up really quick and the water just runs off. And you end up getting these kind of systems. This is an image I took in Australia, but basically it's the same thing where you get this connectivity of flow pathways on the surface that all join up very quickly to flood the landscape. And that happens during our extreme events. And again, looking at, could I get a glass of water? It would have, well, I'm going to lose my voice, I'm so sorry. This is not a model. This is data. This is real data that I'm going to show you now. And this is for Europe. And some of our scientists were involved in the publication analysis of this work at Maynooth. Our Icarus group, our climatologist, one of the best in the world, in fact, in Maynooth. And what this is showing you is a bunch of scientists got together, cleaned all their data, and analysed all their data for years between 1960 and 2010. And you know the way you're hearing all the time, oh my God, we're getting more and more floods happening, big storms are happening more frequently. There's no data to support that, actually. There's a lot of our personal experience to support it. But what the data is supporting is that we are now, and the data has proved this, that basically our floods in Ireland are starting earlier. We have an extended flood season happening in Ireland. So here is Ireland, and we're in this blue area here where this data showed that basically floods were extending later and later and later in the year. And in other parts of Ireland, they were happening earlier. So our entire flood season now in Ireland is going to be much, much longer. It is much, much longer than we had thought. This is the documented evidence to show that. So what? Well, this is where the second type of flow comes into play. The first one, remember, was that the rain happens so fast that it doesn't have a chance to get in. They're the big storms. If you have rain starting to fall earlier in the season, by the time you get halfway through our autumn or perhaps early winter, the soils are already drenched. They have no storage capacity left to handle any more rain, whether it's light rain or heavy rain. So you have this saturation excess overland flow is what it's called. So all the pore spaces are completely full of water. So any rain that does fall has no choice but to basically flow off the surface. And this is a very familiar image from what we see in our fields in Ireland. So we are absolutely subject to this saturation excess overland flow as well. So what effect will it have? Well, basically flooding is in our future, okay? No matter what we talk about in terms of what we might do, whether it's hard or soft engineering, we are all going to be subjected to floods. Reality, and basically let's try and deal with it. Let's come up with the best ways to deal with it. But there will be a massive economic effect of this. And if we just think about the agricultural sector, basically, if we look at the words that we have for our own season, for our own months, September, Manfor, that actually translate to be the middle of the harvest. October, therefore, end of the harvest. They're not going to be able to harvest in September and October anymore if we're having this extended flood period. If it's going to start raining and flooding in September and October, this is going to introduce massive issues in terms of the farming economy in Ireland, as just one example of the impact of this future trend. So I showed you the European data. This is the Irish data. Okay, so this was a summary that was put together by Margaret Desmond, and our observed data says that rainfall has increased by 5%. We have no change in our extreme weather, despite, us all thinking that there's something funky going on. And flooding, we have seen an increase in the winter floods. And in terms of prediction, we're going to see a decrease in the spring and summer rainfall. We're going to see fewer storms. Good news, bad news. The ones that do arrive will be far more intense. Okay? And then we're going to see an overall increase in the winter and spring floods by 20% and a decrease in the summer floods. So drier, hotter summers, hooray! And really bad winters. Okay? So, in terms of the effects of floods, I just want to let you know about two effects. And I expect, how many people in here have been flooded? Okay, that's quite a lot. So maybe we can have some discussion around your experiences, and because you're the people, basically, I think that they should have a voice in us talking about what's going to happen in our future in terms of floods, because you've basically know before, during and after how your human response was and how the government responded to you when you asked for help, which I presumably you might have done. But in terms of the effects of floods, you know, obviously there's injury and loss of life potentially. We get erosion and deposition of sediment, damage caused by currents and debris, and all this kind of stuff is happening. But you can see here that this house, which is in Wales, is built in what appears to be, as a geomorphologist, a crazy location, because it's in a constriction. So the water has nowhere to go. It's blocking its own floodplain, and it's got a hard border. So of course the maximum erosion is actually situated on the side of the house itself. And the secondary effect of floods, and this is what I think the narrative that the people who have been flooded can really inform us on will be. We're talking about short-term river pollution. So our water resources become polluted, and this has been experienced with these boil water notices. It happens anyway, but absolutely after floods. Then we have hunger and disease and homelessness. Obviously very pertinent in certain parts of our planet, but I have no doubt, if you look at even at the Donegal case in the Inishowen Peninsula, Carndonagh, people who were moved from their homes are still not back in their homes. They are in other dwellings, but it's not their home. And so they could be considered to be homeless as a result of floods in Ireland. So I want to basically alert you to this idea of factors that affect the flood damage, but I want to talk to you about this land use on floodplain. We have built on our floodplains during the boom. I wasn't here, I was an immigrant at the time, but I've heard all the stories, the brown envelopes, all the silly, silly decisions that have been made, and the houses are there. But the memory that people have around floods is actually really, really short term. You know, we've come through a big spate, but I would say in 6 or 7 years' time, maybe people won't remember that we've just been through these massive big coastal storms and flood events unless they keep on happening. But if we look at the effect of living perhaps in an urban area, I want to show you this video that was taken by some people. It's in Australia, it's in an Australian town, Toowoomba. And this, you can see, I know it's hilarious, except for the person who owns that car. This happened in Carndonagh. This is in Carndonagh. But the flood went through a car sales car park, and the cars were lifted up and washed down the stream. So this is something that is happening all over in these urban areas, and it's resulting in massive urban hazards, as has been mentioned earlier on, has happened in Cork. They're high velocity, they're bringing in sediment pollution, and of course they're moving and destroying infrastructure. And so you end up with cars that become absolutely unusable. And this was what we saw very similar up in Donegal in 2017. These cars that were just pushed against each other in stranded up in areas and totally written off. So urban areas have very different flood effects perhaps to some rural areas, and this needs to be taken into consideration because we have changed the land considerably. The rate at which rainfall is transferred into runoff, which is the surface flow, is very, very quick in urban areas. And here is a woman who was in her four-wheel drive vehicle in a street in Greece in 2013, I think, and she didn't know what was happening. She started to feel the car was kind of being pushed over by the flood, and absolutely terrified. She opened her door. The force of the flood basically pushed her door against the thing. She got out and she started to be pulled underneath the car because, of course, anybody who's ever kayaked and you're told to keep away from trees, because if your kayak gets stuck, you're going to be pulled under those trees and potentially drown. And so her fate was actually okay because she was rescued by other passerby. in this area. But this was a shocking event for Greece. And I think the people of Cork have had shocking events as well. And it's only a matter of luck that these kind of situations haven't happened more frequently. Greece, semi-arid, very flashy fluvial systems, but urban areas are also flashy. So Cork and other hydrographs that we will look at will have a very quick response time to large rainfalls. And what the whole mission behind trying to mitigate these floods is to slow it down, slow down the water, so these situations aren't met as frequently. So the response has been extensive engineering projects. We're looking here at the Mississippi River, which is basically a river that is heavily changed in terms of, here we have a massive levee which is built on the floodplains of the Mississippi, and you can see here people living right up to the edge of the levee. Now, this might give a false sense of security to some people, and this is how we should be thinking about any flood measure: sustainable, engineered, hard, engineered, soft. Okay? That we don't want to get into a false sense of security. So one of the messages I'm trying to convey here is the reality of floods. They are in our future. We can do what we can at the moment to try and mitigate them, but I think we all have to realize that we're probably, a lot of us, either going to be or going to know somebody who's directly affected by floods in our future. They also fail, as I mentioned earlier on. Here we have a breached levee, and once the water goes in and gets trapped behind, it stays behind because it can't get out again because it's dammed behind the levee. So I'm going to use a term called natural water retention. Just because. And you can use whatever term you want, and you can call it and call me whatever you want. Basically, I'm adopting this term because it's a European term and because it has a broader encompassing remit. It includes, under the big heading of natural water retention, it includes flood mitigation, but it also includes other ecosystem services, other benefits such as biodiversity, human health. Okay, so that's why I'm doing it, because another message I want to get across to you is it's not just about mitigating floods. Your responsibility, my responsibility, our collective responsibility. Yes, we need to tackle floods, but there are many other issues that we can tackle at the same time. So what it is it's a multifunctional form of green infrastructure that can play an important role, again, on the catchment scale. So we're looking at big catchment scale efforts, as Chris has alluded to. What we need to do in Ireland is look at the lay of the land, okay? Look at our topography and use it to the maximum benefit for all of these measures. What we are not talking about is creating permanent water storage on the land necessarily. Many of the features that are proposed and that have been deployed retain the water for a period of time, for 12 to 24 hours. We're slowing down the flow, we're not stopping the flow. So we need to think around that, about what do we want to do. So issues that were raised earlier on about farmers going, I'm losing, you know, very valuable assets, will come up, but it's not necessarily the only outcome. I'm working with a farmer in Wexford who can still graze his sheep, who can still have the cattle grazing the land if I put in a retention feature, because it'll be low, it'll be broad, and the sheep will just go up and, you know, nibble on the grass on top of it. So there are many, many different designs that can work with farmers, but I absolutely echo Chris's sentiment. You cannot go in and tell people what to do. You go in and you ask them what they want to do, and you have a chat, and you come up with something. It's called co-design. Okay, we design it together, because you have to bring people with you. There are a multitude of efforts, and I'm not going to stay on this primarily because you probably can't read it from the back of the room, but also because Chris has actually been through much of this himself. But there are a load of different ways that you should consider a catchment as a landscape in which a palimpsest of different measures can be deployed. But what goes where is a bespoke endeavour. You have to basically look at each local area, examine it, and design for that local area. So as Chris has already talked about, it's an opportunity to enhance catchment processes that have been affected by human intervention, which is pretty much everywhere in Ireland. I don't think we have a wilderness left in Ireland. And the aim in terms of our topic today is to reduce the hazard of flood. Now the hazard of flood involves humans. That's why it's a hazard. Floods no, they don't happen. They have happened on Mars, but they're not hazards because there's no humans there or equipment that have been affected by them. So hazards involve humans. And so here's an example of some of these efforts that have been deployed. These are called leaky dams. They're designed to leak. They're designed to slow the flow. So here's a dry one and here's a wet one. And it's only a small little pond of water that's retained there for about 30 seconds. It'll slow down the water by about 30 seconds. But if you have a small forested catchment and you have 20 of these separated by 20 or 30 metres in a row, and you add all that up, it's the cumulative benefit in a certain stretch of river that will give you the larger benefit in terms of your flood. And what is really important, I think, for all of us, given the financial restraints that we have, that these are low risk and they are low cost, and they're relatively easy to build. A couple of strong women and some men can basically lift these, cut them down and put them across the channel without any massive impact on their backs. So to re-emphasize, it needs to be community-led. We need to build the capacity of landowners, contractors and volunteers. And I think there's great opportunity here for small industries to happen, small businesses to happen, small groups, people with training in how to operate machinery, who know wood, to come in and basically learn the skill, and then they will have an employment avenue for them. They will be asked to come in and do it because they've proven on Farmer Jane's, they'll be invited to Farmer Joe's to do the exact same thing. Peatlands. An enormous amount of our country is covered in upland peats, whether it's blanket bogs, raised bogs. They have a capacity to store water, particularly in Ireland where we've drained so many of them. But that potential is limited. The minute we restore these peatlands, we restore their ability to retain more water because they're full of water. But we have extensive areas with these linear drains. They're quite deep often. They're a metre wide, a metre deep. But you can slow the water by throwing in other turf dams in it at frequent intervals, and they might end up looking, after a period of time, looking at something like this. This is about 20 years old. This is the Liffeyhead Bog that was restored under the initiative of a single National Parks ranger who just decided we're going to restore this and went about and did it and found the money for it. And this is what it looks like now, and it actually is a beautiful, serene landscape now compared to an adjacent peatland that I've come across next door. One thing that's really effective, has been demonstrated to be effective, is this reconnecting the rivers to their own floodplains. And in Ireland, as a geomorphologist, some of my students have mapped the old paths that rivers took before the arterial drainage network scheme came in, and we straightened everything and deepened everything. And we have on our floodplains whole sequences, and this is not Ireland, but whole sequences of old abandoned channels. Anyone here remember geography, Oxbow Lakes? Yeah, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about Oxbow Lakes. And we're talking about reconnecting the river to these Oxbow Lakes. Not all the time, but just when the water gets so high in the channel, it'll flow that way. And by going the long way around, it's taking longer. And so we're slowing the flow. We're not keeping it on the floodplain. We're not keeping it in the Paleo Channel necessarily. We can if we want for a longer period. But just that longer path is more effective in slowing the flow. Looking at forests and the potential for forests, this is an Environment Agency publication, and these are all available online for all of you to take down, read and learn from. But there's a whole range of different forest types that can be put in on sloping lands, right beside the river, riparian, or even across a floodplain. They provide, this is where it comes in, this is where the natural water retention is important. They provide the additional ecosystem services. So what you're looking at here is a graph that basically shows for one type of woodland, a floodplain woodland, and you're looking here at cultural activity, water, habitat, climate regulation, health, floods, and the aesthetic. And so there is this evolving, I suppose, global movement in terms of putting a value on nature. It's called natural capital. What do we put to the value of being able to go after this, go out into the fresh air and take a walk in a park and look at the trees and smell the sea air? What is the dollar value on that? I don't know, but we're trying to come up with some kind of way of valuing these aspects of nature. This is one of the ecosystem services that all of these natural water retention measures can provide for human health, lowering stress levels. There was an article in the Irish Times recently about how much our stress levels are lowered by just one walk in a park a week. I haven't done it yet, but I know about it. I'm too stressed, I have too much to do. So, drilling at home, co-benefits, enhanced biodiversity, improved soil and water quality. We can sequester a lot of this carbon that we've released from draining our bogs for eons. We can reduce soil erosion. We can lead to greater agricultural productivity. So this is a message that we can give to the agricultural sector, that we can improve your productivity. You don't have to increase your earnings by overstocking. That is one way that is deployed. But if you improve your soil, you can improve your productivity. So this soil erosion, I don't know how many, I have definitely seen this coming, this big rainfall on arable land, and you're getting the soil and the water running off down the street. That's bad. That's bad for everything. It's bad for the water. It's bad for the farmer. He or she is losing his topsoil, and that's where your nutrients are. That's where your productive soil is. It's a very thin layer on the top of these fields, and it's all running off down the street here. So often this would be a kind of a graphic, a drawing of this particular phenomenon. And what one of the natural water retention measures would aim to do would be to build what's called this corner field bund. And you can barely see it here because this was built and literally the next day the rainfall event that was photographed here was taken. So you're looking at this arable field, you can see some gullies, you can certainly see some pathways of flow, and here we have a bund that's been built in the corner of the field, trapping that sediment and trapping the water. And what's wonderful about these is these are soft engineered structures, so they're not like concrete and you can't change them, because they actually found when the runoff happened that the bund wasn't perfectly shaped, and they went back in the next day and moved it out a little bit and rebuilt that part of it so they could better capture the sediment and the water. And that, I think, is a truly positive aspect of these measures. And of course, this is the graphic that shows you the storage of the water and the sediment, and that sediment can be redistributed. And that water is not permanent. They didn't have a chance because it happened too quick, but subsequently they put in an overflow pipe, and it slows the flow. The water and the sediment just drains quickly in terms of one day out of these structures. So does it work? Yes, it does. Chris basically very eloquently demonstrated that, so I'm not going to get into that in too much detail. It's very limited in terms of what it's been proven to work, and the narrative around it now is that basically it works for small events, it works for small catchments, and people are incorrectly saying it doesn't work for big events and it doesn't work for big catchments. The models show that it's probably unlikely that it will work, but we don't have any data yet. And the UK have now heavily invested in funding several, maybe three big consortiums in the UK that are basically going to go and collect the data on whether or not it could work for bigger events and big catchments. But I don't think that's the point. Okay? There's a concept that's emerging in the United States of America that's to do with coastal floods. And of course, coastal floods are an issue here in Cork as well, but we're dealing with fluvial floods today. So this is called nuisance floods. So floods, you get small floods that happen frequently and big floods that happen less frequently. The small floods that happen frequently have a cost associated with them, whether it's you can't get to work, your electricity, your power is cut off, your water is polluted, you can't get the kids to school. Like there's a lot of small effects that happen during these smaller floods. And there's a cost with that. And they happen more frequently than the rare big events. And the sum total of the cost of those smaller floods exceeds the cost of the one big flood that'll happen every 20 years. And they're called nuisance floods because they're a bloody nuisance. Okay? They're coming, they're gone. But they have a cost associated with them. And if in the end we find that natural water retention measures are only effective for the smaller floods, I do not have an issue with that. Because of this economic reason, but because these small events affect small catchments where people also live. Okay? So Ireland. When I got back, first of all, there was an issue. We had the Water Framework Directive, we had the Floods Directive, we had the EPA in charge of the Water Framework Directive, we had the OPW in charge of the Floods Directives, and they were not talking to each other. They are now. And that is thanks to the EPA and the OPW. Okay, we all sit it and over a cup of tea going, Jesus Christ, how are we ever getting? But actually, it's the people who are leading these organisations came to the realisation that we need this national scale endeavour. And it was, I think, as a result of many of the big events that happened, these national emergency programmes that needed to be put in place because the scale of the events were national. So all of the agencies were suddenly involved. But whatever the reason behind it, it is happening, okay? And so now they are talking to each other and they're working together. So what is our future in Ireland in terms of these? Well, I think it's pretty bright. This is a data set. It's an ArcGIS data set, and these small little packages are all the electoral boundaries because that's where the data comes in Ireland. And it's basically showing you agricultural land that's deemed of high natural value, medium and low natural value, okay? So they have good connectivity of their water systems, they have biodiversity, they have a range of species of animals and plants on their farmland. And you can see in Ireland that there is quite a lot of high, the greens are the high, the yellows are the not so high, and the blues are not great. But if you think about most of Ireland is agricultural, Chris mentioned before Scotland was back up to 15%, I think, and maybe correct me, we have 11% of our land is forested at the moment, and we definitely need to up that. 8, 11, it's still too low, okay? In terms, most of our land is agricultural, right? And now I'm telling you that the data is suggesting that it inherently has a high nature value to it. That's really good news. That's a resource that we can actually use and step on in pushing this forward. And so we can restore and create new wetlands, we can restore peat bogs, we can reconnect channels with their floodplains, and we can encourage the growth of native woodlands. Not necessarily the commercial monospecies approach, but native woodlands. So I think we have opportunity here, just inherently before any political agenda comes into play. I think our landscape, our island, has good primary qualifications for this. In terms of how we might go to do it, in terms of organising change and effective change, I have had interactions with river trusts and I think they are absolutely fantastic, and I commend you in this group, whether you call yourself a river trust or a Edelson, what do you call it, whatever it is, like it doesn't matter, you're coming together and it's the grassroots kind of movement that is empowering people to not look and go, I can't do anything, but it's like together we can maybe do something. And so this is an out-of-date river trust map basically for the UK. Oh my gosh, so impressive. These are all the river trust organisations, and this is what it was for Ireland a while ago. But last night I saw on the news the East Wicklow River Trust has just launched. And I know that there's one in Cork, and my hope is, I don't know if there's one in the Lee, but I think it'd be a great idea. But I think that that's one of the instruments that you can use. I mean, Chris has made a really important point earlier on today, where he talked about the fact that getting through political change, getting through policies, it was the NGOs, of which you would be if you were, well, you are an NGO. You have power, you don't understand the power you have, maybe. I hope you do. But basically, get together you plus for all of Cork. Join up to the neighbouring counties and go for it. I can't encourage you enough to do that. I think that is a very positive outcome that could come from a meeting like this. What's been done for Cork? I want to talk about, and I don't know if I'm way over time, 5 minutes, holy gosh. Very quickly, the OPW were responding, I think, to pressure from the Cork community about the potential for natural flood mitigation measures. And they hired an engineering company, Arup, to basically put together a plan. Okay, you've got a problem in Cork City, let's put together a natural flood management plan and see if it'll work. They basically had a specific question in mind, and that was, is NFM effective for mitigating the 1 in 100 year flood for Cork City? Cork, the Lee catchment in Cork is a 1,200 kilometre square catchment. No one in the world has ever tried to see if it could work for catchments that size. But the OPW wanted them to do it, so they did. And so the model output, and it is a modelling output, and we're going back to this idea of observed versus modelled data, is that they said it would need, and they designed it so that it could install over 3,000 features of 2 different types on the floodplains and overland flow, and it could store in excess of almost 1.5 million cubic meters of water. But when they modelled it, they found that the effect of installing all of these measures and the cost associated with that for Cork, for the waterworks weir at Cork City, very specific data point, it was 4.5%, between 0.5% and 4.5%, and so it was deemed ineffective. Wouldn't be cost effective. Not only would it not be cost effective, but that number of features to be installed would require negotiation with several hundred landowners, and that is a massive challenge, and it has been brought up previously. What the report also includes is an examination of smaller catchments in the Lee, and what I want to draw your eye to are the orange bits. And for this particular catchment here, what's called the Upper Lee 1, we're seeing a 15% reduction in the flood peak, and that is effective. That is a powerful reduction through natural water retention measures on flood peaks that could come out. And this again is just a modelling study. So I think that the Upper Lee has enormous potential for these natural. So what am I doing, and what are we, as in terms of experts, doing about the problem of flooding in the Lee? Well, transfer, not transplant. Okay, I think we are very lucky to have neighbours that we have in the UK who have cottoned onto this, Scotland in particular, to lead the way on this. And they have built up a huge wealth of knowledge and experience and expertise. I do not want to transplant that knowledge to Ireland, but I do want to transfer. And the difference between transplant and transfer is that in a transfer, we take the essence of it and we see where and where it will not work in Ireland, because Ireland is not the same as the UK, and I'm speaking as a geologist now, as a geomorphologist. We have different rocks, different lands, different histories, different land uses, different policies that all affect everything, and in particular our people are different, and our attachment to land is different, and how we'll respond to being told to do something by the government is different. So all of these need to be taken into consideration in terms of how we approach it. So my policy is to transfer, but not to transplant, the huge and rich body of knowledge from the UK and from Europe more broadly to Ireland in the next while. I am working with local communities to try and help them sort out how to begin and approach this. I am training the next generation. We have had just this year 2 really excellent master's students. Both of them one of them got a medal and the other got a first class honour for designing natural water retention measures for a catchment in the Upper Lee. One of them is an engineer and the other is a net scientist. One was based in the University of Newcastle working with Paul Quinn, and one was based in Trinity with me. And it basically took this idea of you can use ponds, you can use leaky dams, and basically they designed it, they put in a computer space the potential design for a specific known catchment in Cork. And Kevin's conclusions, Kevin is a student who's from Cork, who went to Newcastle to do his master's, he's back in Ireland. He decided that the analysis demonstrated that the valley upstream of Ballingeary is suitable. So we actually have our first study done in Ireland for the Lee. The groundwork has been done. The next question is the implementation. And we talked about costs earlier on, but this is just to show you the kind of cost. We're talking about 850 for a 50-metre long arcuate bund, for example. We're talking about 5,000 for the construction of ponds. So there's a range in prices for these kind of measures. And we'll have to do our own investigation for the cost in Ireland, etc. But I think we can do this. This isn't, 50 grand, 500,000, to put in a couple of features. And why this is important is that we need to put in demonstration features. You need to build them. If you build them, they will come. The people, the politicians, as Chris said, they will come to see these features, see that they're not, going to lose agricultural land, see that they're not an eyesore, see that they're, the farmer will be able to tell you, sure, it is no hassle at all, or, oh my God, I couldn't wait to see the back of those people. Like, they'll give you the real McCoy about what it is to build these. The other thing I'm doing is I'm going to collect data myself to build on the research, because one of the resistance to deploying this by the OPW is the lack of data to show that it actually works. So we've just been funded by the EPA to a huge collaborative project that involves University College Cork. Simon, put your hand up. He's the professor down at Cork. He's a collaborator on this. These are the gallery of rogues that are involved in it. So we've got Paul Quinn and we've got Mark Wilkinson, and we're going to hire 2 PhD students and a postdoc to work on it. But we already have hired a PhD student. Hello, welcome, I haven't met you yet. Lovely. And this is what we're doing. We're building the next generation of expertise who will hopefully stay here and go work for the OPW and go work for the EPA to enable us all to have, just going to spread it through this knowledge base and this expertise base through the Irish institutions. So we're going to basically focus on agricultural land. We're going to build demonstration sites. We're going to collect data. And actually, we're going to show whether or not it works. I'm a scientist. And everything up to now has basically led you to think, Asher Mary believes in national flood management and natural water retention measures. I need to see the data for Ireland. I need to see what works and what doesn't work. So not only am I working with the EPA project in the agricultural sector, and I should tell you that the OPW are putting up 50% of the funding for that $500,000 grant. They're not only saying they want it done, they're providing the funds to do it. I've got an IRC postdoc who's going to work on flooding in forests. The OPW have put money into that too, and I've got a student working on peatlands. So I'm trying to cover all the kind of land use so that at least in 4 years' time we'll have some data in all of these environments that hopefully you will all be able to build in. But my final question is, that's what I'm going to do. What are you going to do? Thank you.